My pleasure always to come in this season on Fridays and hear reading. I get read to, and it's just such a pleasure. This is our 31st annual Colorado Book Awards finalist reading series. We want to thank our sponsors, Unite for Literacy and the Colorado Sun, with whom Colorado Humanities partners on Sunlit's Sunday excerpts of Colorado authors' books. So tonight I'm pleased to introduce you to 3 talented writers whose books have been named by Colorado Book Awards selectors as the finalists in science fiction fantasy category. Unfortunately, the 3 finalists in the thriller category could not be here tonight, but copies of all the finalist books are available for purchase anytime. You can ask the finalists to sign your books, and please enjoy Book Bar's great snacks and drinks during and after the readings. Colorado Humanities has sprung for some group snacks up here. Feel free to come up and get a bite. Our first reader tonight is Todd Fahnestock, who will read from his book, Khyven the Unkillable. I wanted to make it into Kevin because that's my brother. But before I go on, I want to say how much I appreciate how science fiction and fantasy can help us imagine different worlds, and how moving to different worlds and times helps free us up. I just picked up a copy of The Left Hand of Darkness, Ursula Le Guin's masterpiece, which is I used to read this genre all the time. And I just thank you for expanding our imaginative universe, if you will. Anyway, Todd is a writer of fantasy for all ages and a winner of the New York Public Library's Books for the Teenage Award. Threadweavers and the Whisper Prince trilogy are 2 of his best-selling epic fantasy series. He is a 2021 Colorado Book Award finalist and winner of the Colorado Authors League Award for Writing Excellence for Tower of the Four, the Champions Academy. Todd lives in Inglewood. Todd, please. Thank you.
Can I move this? Is it gonna like totally mess around? Maybe I shouldn't touch that. So it's interesting, if I can say for just a second, so she mentioned that Kevin is is it your son, you said? Brother. Your brother, okay, your brother. Does anybody here know Kevin J. Anderson? He writes for Dune, he writes for Star Wars. He's pretty big in the industry. In fact, he was a huge name on the recent Dune movie. Anyways, he's a friend, and we recreated this cover and took Khyven out and put Kevin in, and then photoshopped his face over the thing and gave it to him. We made a T-shirt for him, in fact, so he enjoyed that. All right, so without further ado, Khyven the Unkillable, Chapter 1. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. 2 knights threw open the doors of the tavern, and the scent of last night's rain blew in with them. Khyven heard their boots thump on the rough planks, heard the creak of leather and chink and clink of chainmail as they shifted. He sat with his back to them, but he didn't need to see them to know where they were. The room went silent. This dockside drinking hole didn't see knights very often, and their appearance had rendered the entire place speechless. That was respect. That was what being a knight meant in the kingdom of Usara. They paused just inside the threshold, perhaps hoping to spook the fearful, but Khyven wasn't a jumper. He had more in common with the newcomers than those who fled from them. Isla, the pretty barmaid sitting across from him, looked past Khyven, her eyes wide. She had been a lively conversationalist a moment ago, and he had been daydreaming about what it would be like to kiss those lips. Now, she looked like an alley cat who'd spotted an alley dog. Reflexively, she stood up, the wooden stool scraping loudly on the floor. She froze, perhaps realizing belatedly that when the powerful, the predators, were in the room, it was best not to draw attention to yourself. Khyven heard the metallic rustle of the fighter's chainmail, and Isla's face drained of color. He envisioned the alley dogs turning at the sound, focusing on her. She needn't have worried. They weren't here for her or any other patron of the Mariner's Rest. They were here for Khyven. He had killed a man in the night ring 2 days ago, and not just any man, a duke's son. The entitled whelp had actually been a talented swordsman, but His ambition had outstripped his skill, and the night ring was an unforgiving place to discover such a weakness. After Khyven had run the boy through, Duke Barencourt had sworn revenge. No doubt he had been waiting for an opportunity to find Khyven alone, vulnerable, to send in his butcher knights. Men like these, sent to enforce a lord's will or show his displeasure, were called butcher knights, usually of the lowest caste, Knights of the Steel. Butcher knights didn't chase glory on the battlefield or renown in the night ring. They were sent to do bloody, back-alley work at their lord's bidding. Khyven took a deep breath of the smoky air, sipped from the glass of Triaden whiskey, and enjoyed the fading burn down his throat. The booted feet thumped to a stop next to his table. Khyven the Unkillable, one of the men spoke, using Khyven's ringer name, the flamboyant moniker the crowd had laid upon him. Khyven glanced over his shoulder. Indeed, he had guessed right. The pair were Knights of the Steel. There were 3 castes of knights in Usara: Knights of the Sun, Knights of the Dark, and Knights of the Steel, which was the lowest caste and the only one available to most lords. The pair wore chainmail shirts instead of full plate, conical steel caps with nose guards instead of full helms, and leather greaves and bracers. As predicted, they wore Duke Barencourt's crest on their left shoulders. There was a code of honor among knights, even butcher knights. Except in cases of war, civility was required before gutting a man, especially when there were onlookers. Often a knight would give a flowery speech, including the offense he'd been sent to address, before drawing weapons. This was enough to justify murder. Sometimes there was no flowery speech, but a knight would always at least say their victim's name. If the victim acknowledged their name, that was all it took to bring out the blades. Khyven didn't give them the satisfaction. He took another sip of his whiskey and said nothing. "Did you hear me?" the knight demanded, his hand touching his sword hilt. If Khyven had been a normal ringer, a caged slave thrown into the night ring to slay or be slain for the sport of the crowd, these men would probably have foregone their code of honor and drawn their swords already. But Khyven wasn't just any ringer. He was the champion of the night ring, and the king had afforded him special privileges because of that fact, like a room at the palace. Khyven had survived 48 bouts, the longest string of victories since Vex the Victorious had claimed 50, won a knighthood, and become the king's personal bodyguard. Steel scraped on steel, bringing Khyven back to the present. The second knight drew his dagger and placed it against Khyven's throat. Isla gasped and backed away. "You think you're protected," the second knight growled in Khyven's ear. "You're not." Of course, if Khyven didn't acknowledge his name, there were other ways for the butcher knights to start the fight. If Khyven attacked them, for example, they could retaliate. The powerful could always push a victim into a corner when they needed to. That's what the powerful did. Khyven had learned that long ago. That was why, when Khyven had won his 40th bout and his freedom from the night ring, he'd continued fighting, risking his life in every bloody bout for the prize at the end of 10 more, for the power that would come with it. When Khyven won his 50th bout, he would be elevated to knighthood, just like Vex the Victorious, and no one would ever look at him as a victim again. The blade broke the skin, just barely, and a bead of blood trickled down Khyven's neck. His pulse quickened. The familiar euphoria filled him, the rush of pleasure that came with the threat of death. The euphoria brought vision, and Khyven saw with new eyes, his battle eyes. He saw his foe's strengths and weaknesses as swirling blue-colored wind. "You are Khyven the Unkillable," the man breathed in his ear. Khyven chuckled. The second knight's face turned red. He slashed, but Khyven was already moving. He shoved his palm against the man's fist, arresting the strike. The blade nicked Khyven's neck, but that wasn't enough. That wasn't nearly enough. He twisted his assailant's fist, and the man grunted in pain. The dagger fell into Khyven's right hand. The euphoria sang through him, and he saw how this fight would go. The blue wind would show him where he must strike, where his enemies would try to strike. Khyven shoved the dagger's flat steel pommel under the knight's nose guard. The heavy steel jammed into that painful spot just below the man's nose, right above his teeth. Bone crunched. The knight stumbled back with a cry, hands flying to his face and knocking his helm askew. His legs wobbled and gave out, while Khyven delicately pinched the pommel of the falling man's sheathed sword between two fingers, lifting it from its scabbard. With an outraged cry, the first knight pulled his blade and lunged. He was fast, but the blue wind swirled, showing Khyven where he needed to be. He danced with it, one step ahead of it, exploiting the man's weaknesses. Khyven's new opponent was left-handed, which gave him an advantage against those who didn't expect it. Also, he was fast. Those were his strengths, but he leaned on them like a crutch, and that in itself was a weakness. The man thrust at Khyven, a clean, straight strike. Khyven twisted, let the blade come within an inch of him. It licked past his chest like a snake's tongue as he slid inside the man's guard. This close, swordsmanship didn't matter. Belly to belly with the stunned knight, Khyven wrapped his arm around his foe's sword arm and wrenched upward. The man gasped, jumping onto his tiptoes to escape the joint lock. His sword clanged to the ground. Khyven kneed him in the groin. The knight doubled over with a grunt and backed up. The agony of a groin strike always came with a delay, but the realization came immediately. He gave Khyven a wide-eyed look of disbelief. Then the pain hit. With a shuddering gag, he slid to his knees. To his credit, he pulled his dagger, but the hilt clacked on the wood floor as he fell on all fours, gasping for breath, twisting and hoping for some position that would ease the pain. Unfortunately for him, no such position existed. The first knight collapsed onto his side, groaning painfully. Khyven picked up the man's sword and added it to his collection. By this time, the second knight had staggered to his feet, helm lopsided, nose broken, blood pouring down his chin. He blinked one eye and then the other like he was trying to get at least one of them to work correctly. Khyven tossed the dagger, hilt first, at Broken Nose, who yelped and dodged. The dagger hit the bar and thunked to the floor. Well done, Khyven said. Try again? He offered the man's sword next, hilt first. Broken Nose stared at it like it was a rainbow-colored snake. Khyven raised an eyebrow. Yes? No? Would you like it back? The knight took the sword with a shaking hand. Khyven dropped the other blade next to Need in the Groin, who was still doubled up, hands cradling his jewels. The euphoria faded, the blue wind vanished, and Khyven let out a breath. He walked back to the stool, sat down, picked up his glass of Triaden whiskey, and winked at Isla. Khyven was always surrounded by enemies, but that was a good thing. If you remembered everyone was your enemy, you were never surprised when they attacked. A shuffling step behind him told him that Broken Nose had regained some of his courage and, just maybe, was thinking about jumping back into the fray. Come at me again, Khyven said darkly, and I'll pretend we're in the night ring. The shuffling step stopped. Anyways, thank you very much.
Hang on there. Any questions for Todd?
Do they have any questions? Yes.
Okay, this is totally random, but are you planning on reprising your role as hot toddy at the Pikes Peak Writers Conference?
I want to know who paid you to say that.
I need to repeat that in the microphone. Are you reprising your role as hot toddy at the Pikes Peak Writers Conference, Todd?
Request, of course.
Do we want to know more about hot toddy? Can there be a sample of
I'm
hot-
actually not remembering the exact instance, so
It must have been good. Yeah.
Was that with the sachet or
I think that was the year that you and now I'm
Trixie?
Yes, Trixie. Yes, Trixie and Hot Toddy. So she called you Hot Toddy, and I think that was the year that the two of you dressed up as the main characters from
Princess Bride.
Princess Bride.
Yes,
So
yes.
Buttercup
That
and
night I was the man in black.
Yes.
That was a good night.
That was a good night.
So, Todd, is the book a part of a series? And if it is, are there other books in the series? How many?
I'm
Excellent
gonna.
question.
I'm going to repeat that and ask if this book is part of a series and if there's other books in the series.
Yeah. So actually, fantastic question. This is the first book in a multi-author shared world epic fantasy. Oh, sorry. Yeah, let me step up to the mic.
Oh, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
So Khyven the Unkillable is the first novel in a multi-author shared world epic fantasy project that we have going on. There are 5 founding authors for this. Each one has his own continent or her own continent. And each one is going to write 8 books over the next 8 years on their continent. At book 4, the meta plot from each story is going to start to intertwine. So if you love sweeping, huge epic fantasy novels where, like, I mean, we're going to have this big throw the ring into Mount Doom thing at the end where all the main characters, Khyven and his friends and all the other main characters are going to have all these interacting moving parts. In addition to that meta plot, we have guest authors that are coming in and writing in the world just to, do a book or 3 or several in the world. This is a super fun project, and actually, yeah, Kendra is one of those authors, in fact. So she's got, her book is on the slate to come out later this year as well. So anyways, it's a super fun project. Any other questions? Outstanding. Thank you.
Collaboration just makes it so much more fun, doesn't it? It took me a long time as a writer to learn how much more fun it is to work with others. Get out of my little room. So the second finalist in science fiction fantasy is D. Eric Maikranz, who will read from his book, The Reincarnationist Papers. Eric has been a foreign correspondent in Rome and has worked as a tour guide in Rome. We have to talk. A radio host, a bouncer, and as a Silicon Valley software executive. Bouncer and Silicon Valley software executive. So that's a nice, good. So The Reincarnationist Papers, his first novel, has been adapted into a Paramount Pictures film, Infinite. Eric lives in Denver. That is amazing, and your first novel, that's just wonderful. Congratulations, Eric. Thank you.
So how about we give a hand for all of the bookseller heroes here at Book Bar, one of the remaining indie bookstores here in Denver. So my book, The Reincarnationist Papers, I'll give you the brief overview of it. It's a story about a young man who is troubled by complete memories of 2 past lives. Complete memories, skills, languages, loves, losses, everything. And he thinks that he's alone in the world with this existence until he accidentally finds another woman who's exactly like him and brings him into a secret society of others who have remembered their past lives for centuries and who have been drivers of history. And this scene is about where she shares her secret with him because she thinks she's suspected that he's more than he seems. So, troubled by memories of 2 past lives, Vasily and Bobby, and thinking that his condition is unique in the world, Evan, who relates the events in first person, has been shot in the foot as he fled the scene of his latest arson for hire job. He hid behind a church in an industrial neighborhood in Los Angeles where he was rescued by the church's lone occupant, an enigmatic woman named Poppy. Poppy has expertly addressed the young man's injuries and now suspects Evan might be more than he seems, and she has given him an expensive antique cane to help him walk to an unusual picnic spot in a cemetery where she plans to share her secret about remembering past lives in an attempt to discover his. Again, Evan relays the story in first person. She walked briskly out in front of me. The soft ground under the grass made it difficult for me to walk with the cane, and I felt like shouting to her to set the basket down so that we could eat here and I wouldn't have to walk any farther. She walked toward one of the larger vaults, a weathered and rain-streaked gray one. 2 thick columns stood vigil on either side of the wrought iron double doors. 2 squirrels scampered off as she approached. The vault was the size of a small carriage house. As I got closer, I could make out more detail. The same symbol Poppy had tattooed on the back of her hand was carved into the marble above the arched doors where the family name should have been. And it hadn't occurred to me that we might be going to a specific place in this cemetery. I continued my slow, steady pace as she sat the basket down in front of the doors and turned to look at me. Fresh purple flowers sprouted from two metal vases in front of the columns. The surrounding tombstones were large and ornate. "This is a very special place for me," she said when I was about 20 steps away. "Why is it so special?" "It's the resting place of my benefactors." The outfit she wore made sense now, and the purple orchids in front of the vault were the only flowers in sight. "Do you visit here often?" "I come here when I want to think," she said, removing a black skeleton key from her purse. She unlocked the doors and opened them one at a time. The room inside was lit by two small skylights. One shaft of light slanted onto the center of the floor, and the other landed on the left-hand wall. Polished brass plaques lined the left and right walls above two simple stone benches, one on each side. She grabbed the basket and walked inside. I took a step behind her, but stopped in the open doorway. She placed the basket on the bench and sat down beside it as she lifted the veil and removed her sunglasses. "Aren't you coming in?" Now was my chance to press the issue. "You were going to tell me about this," I said, tapping the brass into the cane on the stone floor. "Why don't you ask them?" she said, pointing to the plaques on the opposite wall. "Them?" I thought as I stepped inside. The air was cool. Them. I turned my back to her and looked at the plaques. The second square of sunlight perfectly framed and highlighted one of the brass markers, making the others hard to see. The plaque was 2 feet wide and 1.5 feet tall. The only thing on it was a name, a year of birth, and death. Graciela L. Cruz, 1889 to 1977. Graciela Cruz, is she the one you spoke about? I asked, turning to look at Poppy. Poppy had already placed 2 wine glasses on the bench next to the basket. "Yes, she bought the church." I murmured. "Was this cane hers?" "No, it belonged to Louis." "Who?" "Louis, on this side," she said, pointing to the darker wall behind her. It took several seconds for my eyes to adjust from the shiny sunlit brass of the other side. 6 plaques were set in 2 rows of 3. Names and dates showed on all the plaques. The one she pointed to was in the middle of the bottom row. Louis Lucas Denejon, 1657 to 1723. I looked at it for several seconds, reading the date over and over. I gripped the cane next to my right leg and did the math. Over 250 years old. I thought the cane was old, but I wouldn't have guessed it was that old. The carved dragon head on the cane seemed to get hotter in my hand as I thought about the significance of such a gift. And I was more determined than ever to find out what was going on. My eyes wandered to the neighboring plaques as I formulated my next question for Poppy. The one to the left of Louis read Marco Parcalis, 1630 to 1657. The one on the right of the bottom row read Colleen Corin McGregor, 1723 to 1761. I started to see the pattern in the dates, and I stood straight up to look at the row above. Nesla, 1506 to 1524. Bando, 1524 to 1540. And Bahram al-Malik, 1540 to 1630, looked back at me from left to right. The cane clicked on the stone floor as I turned to look at the plaques on the other wall. Diana Marie Dugan, 1761 to 1824, was on the top row of the left, and Dr. Hans M. Roeder, 1824 to 1899, was in the middle. Graciela still shined in the sunlight on the right. The three plaques below were all blank. My eyes defocused as I thought about my own timeline. 3 lives interrupted from 1892 until now. It all began to make sense. The crude enamel basin, the antique crutch, the cane. I ran my hand over the warm brass of Graciella's monument as fragmented thoughts coalesced in my mind. She would have been 3 years older than Vasily. I turned and looked at Poppy, and she was staring at me again, but I had expected it this time. I think I understand, I said, my voice almost cracking. I think you understand too, she said, her facial expression warmed as she continued. You're like me, aren't you? Thank you.
Questions for Eric?
Yes, Todd.
So yeah, so I want to know like where the inspiration to do something about past lives came from.
So the inspiration for the book and having the theme around past lives, it comes from 2 areas. Number one, I actually have 3 short memories that don't belong to me. And they're like, in computer science, they're like uncatalogued files that just don't index, but they're as real as any other memories that I have. They're very short, they're about 30 seconds long, and they're all when I'm a boy. But they predate my life, and I thought, what would it be like if you remembered everything? So that was the first catalyst. And then the second thing is, we always hear the saying, oh, if I only knew then what I know now, I would make better decisions. I would be, rich. I would have bought, Amazon stock at $10 or whatever, right? And then I thought, what would it be like if you had the experiences, the wisdom of 200 years or 400 years in a 20-year-old body or in a 30-year-old body? What would those characters be like? And I thought those would be really fun characters to write about and hopefully really fun characters to read about. So that's it. Yes?
So at some point, you break out a Ouija board in this book?
No Ouija boards. Ouija boards freak me out.
That's good, because that's always path to something really, really bad.
Yes, there's no good outcomes from that.
And the other thing that I was wondering about is, like, has anybody told you that this is a great idea for, like, a new sort of dating site? It's like, oh, I suppose you're like me.
Not a dating site, but I do, on my author website, I do have the ability for people to tell me their, like, stories about fragments of their past life memories, like mine. And it's been amazing. I've actually received like, 20 or 30 of them so far, and I've posted about half of them. And it's really interesting to this was kind of when I had my moment where I realized I'm not alone. I'm not the only weird one. Did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. To maybe the question, is this also part of a series?
Thank you. It is part of a series. It's the Reincarnationist Papers is the first book, and that'll also be the name of the series. The second book is called the Cognamina Codex, and I just sold it about 2 months ago. Yes. And it should be coming out, and you can get it here at Book Bar on May 7th, 2023. All right, thank you. It's been my pleasure to read for you.
What a vast universe you have to explore.
Yes.
It's really exciting. Lastly, we'll hear from Kendra Merritt, who wrote Magic and Misrule. Books have been Kendra's escape for as long as she can remember. She used to hide fantasy novels behind her government textbook in high school. This explains the state of America today, right there. And she wrote most of her first novel during a semester of college algebra. Older and wiser now, but just as nerdy, Kendra writes fantasy with unexpected heroes. She lives in Denver. Kendra.
this here, and it's probably going to fall over at some point on me. Okay, hi. I don't have the book to hold up, but it's over there somewhere. So I wrote Magic and Misrule. It's the first book in the Mishaps Heroes series, which is a D&D inspired comedic fantasy, where the world's worst heroes get together and figure out all the ways not to save the day, as most good adventuring parties usually do. This piece that I'm going to be reading, it actually comes fairly early in the book. After Vola, who is our hero, she's on the cover, she has vowed to find whoever is kidnapping and replacing townspeople with illusions of themselves. So now she just needs a party to help her. Unfortunately, the selection is limited. All right. In the morning, Vola set herself up at one of the tables at the back of the tea and tap room and arranged a billboard right outside the door of the bar and another in front of her table, which read, "Looking for adventurers, experienced explorers apply inside. Vanquish evil and earn both money and fame." Henry's lessons had not included compelling sign writing. By mid-afternoon, Vola was ready to beat her head against the table. A knobbly youth dressed in dirty trousers and a faded shirt stepped up to her. "Name," Vola said, then made the mistake of smiling at him. He staggered back a step. "Ricky," he said. He tried to hide his hands, but it didn't do him any good when his entire body shook. Apparently, the promise of gold outweighed the terror of conversing politely with a half-orc. "Well, Ricky, do you have any previous combat experience?" Vola asked. Not yet." Over his shoulder, she noticed Braden. The redhead was setting up a table at the opposite end of the room. The sign propped next to him read, "Honor, glory, and fame. Find these and more when you join your fellow neighbors to fight evil and win back your family members." Vola scowled. He'd stolen her idea. And he was better at writing signs than she was. Already, a line was forming at his table, full of strapping young men and promising-looking women. And here she sat with Ricky. "Have you handled a weapon?" she said. "My dad says a pitchfork is a weapon if you hold it right." Vola made a show of shuffling through a stack of papers. "Well, thank you, Ricky. I'll keep your application on file and get back to you with a decision." Ricky's head bobbed, and a smile flitted across his face as if he was a little relieved she hadn't thrown some gear at him and marched him out of town. The youth hunched away, over to join Braden's line. Vola let the papers fall and buried her head in her hands. She might have been desperate, but she wasn't in the business of recruiting farm boys with delusions of not dying. Someone sat with a thump on the seat in front of Vola's table, making her jump. "So when do we leave?" Sorrel asked. The halfling Vola had met before had slung a quarterstaff across her back, and she'd managed to sit with it, even though the thing was twice as tall as she was. Well, Vola had been looking for competent adventurers. She pulled the stack of paper closer and smoothed the edges self-consciously. If the halfling leaned forward, she'd see there wasn't actually anything written on any of them. But Vola felt more official with the paper serving as a barrier between herself and the rest of the world. "I didn't think you were coming back," Vola said. Sorrel's brow drew down with hurt. "I just had to go get my things. I figured we'd be going after the kidnappers. That's what we're doing, right?" Vola glanced around the table, but the only thing the halfling had brought with her was the quarterstaff. She shrugged. So far, Sorrel was the closest thing to an adventurer she'd seen in this town. "You can fight," she said, without a hint of question. The halfling nodded succinctly. "Since I was 4. Vola dropped the pages with surprise. 4? She beat Vola by at least 2 years. And she'd thought her parents were insane to take a 6-year-old on a camping trip in goblin territory. "I was raised by the monks in one of Maxim's monasteries and trained in martial arts since I was old enough to force the issue," Sorrel said. Vola blinked, wondering what exactly that meant. She cleared her throat. "Aren't monks supposed to be peaceful? All that meditation and self-reflection stuff?" Just because we know how to hold our tempers doesn't mean we don't know when someone needs a kick in the shins, too. You're not a spellcaster, too, are you? Nope. Drat, I'd really like one of those. Because of the illusions? Smart, the halfling said, and reached for one of the papers. She held the blank sheet in front of her, then frowned. She laid it back down on the table and smoothed it with broad, capable fingers. About the pay, Vola said, clearing her throat. It's, not set in stone yet. She actually had no idea where they were going to get the money to outfit themselves, since this wasn't a full contract. But her sign had looked so incomplete without those squiggly little gold coins she'd drawn in the corners. Sorrel waved a hand. I don't care about the money. You can keep my share. Vola blinked. What? All adventurers cared about was gold. I've been sleeping on a stone slab since I was a baby. I eat gruel and drink cheap beer. I fight with a glorified stick. She touched the quarterstaff on her shoulder and shrugged. What use do I have for gold? Then why are you so eager to come along, Vola said, eyes narrowing. Sorrel shrugged again. I won't make any secret of it. It's the illusions, the golems. I'm trying to find Maxim's warhammer, and the last time it was seen in the mortal world, it was capable of that sort of magic. Sorrel was looking for the weapon of a god. Not just any god either, the greater virtue Maxim, who was the god of strength and loyalty. Vola had lost count of the number of paladins who followed him. So you think the kidnappers might be using a god's weapon to replace townspeople? Vola said, tilting her head. Sorrel sighed gustily. It's the only clue I have, and I'm not a spellcaster, so I don't have a lot to go on to begin with. She shifted her chair back with a bright screech against the floor to survey the room. Do you think any of these guys have magic? The assorted blonde and brown humans who sat at their tables and waited in Braden's line scowled at them. Vola scowled back. Sorrel was getting some equally strange and hostile looks, but the halfling just swung her feet and returned the looks with a bright open grin. Over Sorrel's shoulder, the door of the tea and tap room opened, and a young woman poked her head in. Red gold hair fell down her back in silky waves, and she pushed it over her shoulder with a practiced gesture. She glanced around the room with a pair of vivid blue-green eyes before her gaze latched on Vola's table and the sign. The girl shuffled inside and made her way across the floor. Halfway through the room, she tripped over the leg of a chair, stumbled a few steps, and then righted herself, her cheeks stained red. She skipped the last few steps to the table and said breathlessly, "Are you the one offering gold for a rescue mission?" Her voice was sweet and melodic. Vola could imagine her with a lute and a filmy gauze dress, strumming for the pleasure of some noble lord. Vola tried not to roll her eyes. This young woman was the mirror image of the perfect pale village girls Vola had longed to look like when she was a little younger and less settled in her own skin. From the perfect hair to the wide, beautiful eyes. Sure, she was shorter and thicker than the stick figures Vola's village had revered 10 years ago, but that didn't hide the clear pink skin and delicate features she undoubtedly took for granted. There was no way this soft beauty would be worth anything out in the field, save as bait. Vola tapped her sign. "I'm looking for warriors. Are you trained in combat?" No, but I..." Vola met Sorrel's eyes, and the halfling monk gave her a sympathetic shrug. "Have you had any experience fighting?" The young woman's face went sickly pale, losing all of its healthy glow, and she dropped her incredible gaze. "Yes, a little. Once." She raised her eyes again to catch Vola's unguarded expression. She swallowed. "I'm sorry, I'm so... She gestured to herself. "But I need the money." Vola tried to soften her expression. If nothing else, this woman had enough courage to look a half-orc in the eye and ask for a job with no skills or recommendations. Paladins were called to help all those in need, and it would break her heart to turn away this lovely hobo. But she couldn't afford to have someone on her team who couldn't defend herself. Sorrel and Vola would spend all their time trying to keep her alive. "I'm sorry," Vola said, "but..." A beefy farmer from the next table over stood up, letting his chair screech back. In the back of her mind, Vola had noticed him ogling. The farmer stepped up behind the young woman and put a hand on her shoulder. He leaned close to breathe on her neck. "If you need a place to stay the night, half of my bed is empty," he said. Vola's hand closed over the hilt of her sword, which hung in its sheath behind her. But before her fingers could even find their grip, the young woman's gaze flashed up, all uncertainty gone. "I suggest you remove your hand from my shoulder before I remove it from your person," she said. The farmer guffawed. The young woman placed her fingers on the back of his hand, and a spark zipped between them. His laughter turned into screams, and he snatched his hand back to cradle it against his chest. The girl turned, her fingers twisting in a complicated spell before a ball of fire formed between her palms. "Would you like to continue this conversation?" The farmer took one look at the young woman's hands and her implacable expression, then ran. Her mouth thinned into something that wasn't quite a smirk. "I didn't think so." She turned back to the table, then tripped on her bootlace, fell backward, and sent a fireball directly into the ceiling. Should I just stay here? Todd.
So, it's my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong about that, but that this sort of came on you like a storm, this idea. And the series, you started it and finished it in a pretty quick period of time. I want to know what that relampido was, what that lightning strike was that kicked you off.
A conglomeration of lots of gamer nights. So clearly this came out of lots of D&D, lots of Guild Wars 2 with my girls. Our girls' night includes, going and sitting down at the computer with a headset and murdering monsters. Because that's, how is that not every girls' night? So yeah, that's definitely where this came from. And it was kind of a buildup of all of those like ridiculous moments where, you just fail at saving the day, fail at saving the world over and over until, you reset, you respawn, and then you save it the real way. And so that was definitely the inspiration for this series. And after playing D&D for so many times, I have played both Lily and Sorrel. Lily is the girl that you just met who fireballs the ceiling. But definitely kind of came from this moment of, what would happen if these two were friends? Because, they were in two different campaigns. And so I wanted to stick them together and see what that happened, or what happened with that. And yeah, I mean, I guess it was kind of fast. It was, 6 books, and I wrote them in a year and pushed them out in 6 months. So I think it was easier to do that because I knew the characters so well. Instead of having to recreate characters with each book, I was basically just building on the foundation of the one right before. So I blame that. And the fact that I didn't have the second kid yet. She came out a week after the first book did, so. Any other questions? Oh, Eric.
So I have a comment and then a question.
Okay.
The comment is hearing about halflings, half-orcs, paladins, it's just such comfort food for a role-playing gamer, right? I just loved it. But can you talk about if your experience as a role-playing gamer affected or sort of equipped you to be an author?
Let's see. Actually, I was an author before I started playing D&D. Yes, I started writing over 20 years ago. I've been writing since I had stories in my head. So I actually didn't start playing D&D until I think probably closer to like 7 or 8 years ago. So it was actually kind of a switch. I think that my writing definitely affected my role-playing, allowed me to come up a little bit with better backstories, better characters, and kind of help create those stories. And it was a very interesting way to create a story. So not to railroad your question, but it was the opposite direction. Definitely the writing informed the role-playing, so I got to. It was much more cooperative, which was really interesting. It feels a lot like writing in the Eldros universe. It's much more cooperative. It's this whole like building a story alongside other storytellers that was really interesting to me, instead of just like sitting in my desk and, you know, typing away at my solitary keyboard. But
If you are kind of new to D&D, like myself, I was playing about a year, less than a year ago, like, could you understand?
oh, absolutely, yeah. You do not need to be. It's D&D inspired, not D&D based. If that makes sense. And yeah, it came out of like the traditional fantasy tropes. There's definitely a lot of like making fun of traditional fantasy tropes, like, you know, woman in a leather bikini, like how much does that really actually protect you? I don't know. Vola has opinions on that. Considering it's her mother wearing it, it's hilarious. That's in the 4th book, just by the way. One of my favorites. But yeah, no, you do not need to be familiar with D&D in order to enjoy the story. I think that it definitely has a lot that if you have played D&D before, you might recognize certain things. Like there's definitely moments of like, well, that was clearly a nat 1. How could you miss? He was like literally standing right in front of you. I don't know, she ran by him with the sword and it hit the wall. But yeah, no, it's definitely more of it was informed by, not based on, so.
Does everybody know what a nat 1 is?
Critical failure.
Okay, well, I just want to say, like, with the leather bikini, it's all about the layers of protection. I wear mine every day just in case.
So does Vola's mom. If any bandits attack, I'll be ready.
It's secondary protection, but, you know, the other thing that I'm wondering about is what do you see authors who are bringing more to light in characters in their books that have visible and invisible disabilities? Like, what are they doing right, and what do you want them to be doing more of?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Clearly someone has been doing their homework. I do a lot with disabilities. Man, some that are doing it right. Let's see. That's okay. To a certain extent. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to turn this into a really, really brief workshop because I think that most things for writing people with disabilities, same with writing people who are a different race than you, and same with writing anybody who is anybody. Every character should be a person first. So I think that authors who are concentrating on making sure that characters are people before they are caricatures, people before they are their disabilities, people before they are their race, as long as they are fully fledged people, then that is doing it right. It's going to be hard to go wrong from there. And you know, a lot of disabilities are very nuanced. There's a huge, you know, spectrum for any disability. It's something that I had to learn myself, is that my experience as, you know, someone with partial paraplegia who uses a wheelchair part of the time, like, that is very different, going to be very different from anybody else who is a partial paraplegic who uses a wheelchair part of the time. Everybody's experience is slightly different, so you get a little bit of grace in there, so that's good. Yeah, so that's how you do it right, is make sure they're a person first. I guess how you do it wrong is to, you know, fall on stereotypes and inspiration porn and, oh, you're so inspirational just for getting out of the door, and if they can get through life in a wheelchair, then by gosh, I can save the world. And, you know, I have opinions, so I would be happy to expound on that at a later date. Thank you for the very insightful question. Any others? All right, I'm going to say goodbye.
All right, this is our last reading in the series this year. I'm having a moment. Thank you to the Book Bar. Thanks to the crew, Ryan with the camera, Betsy Lopez there, Mary Hickey, our coordinator for Colorado Book Awards, Miranda behind the bar, who didn't have time to say hello, so say hello, Miranda. Thanks for coming out, everyone. Thanks to the entrants, the selectors, the judges, the volunteers. And we hope that you'll join us at the Ellie Calkins Opera House Studio Loft on June 25th at 4:30 p.m. It's going to be the hottest book party in town. We have Kevin Taylor catering this year, COVID special. We can never afford this place. Please join us. Tickets are only $30. You get a drink and a reception you get read to later. It's just wonderful. And we hope that you'll join us. If you need a ticket, see coloradohumanities.org. Thank you for coming out to support Colorado writers. Having you here makes all the difference. And we look forward to seeing you at Ellie Calkins on June 25th. Thanks again.